Sup, team? Today I'm reading The Bolshevik Revolution and Workers' Control in Russian Industry by Paul H. Avrich. Quote, in essence, the entire question of control amounts to whom controls whom, that is, which class is the controller and which is the controlled. End quote. Lenin. On the first anniversary of the October Revolution, Lenin admitted to the Sixth Congress of Soviets that a year earlier he had been well aware that workers' control of industry would be, quote, chaotic, shattering, primitive, incomplete, end quote. Lenin had known that the syndicalist flood which burst upon Russia in the spring of 1917 would have to be controlled before that syndicalist flood engulfed the revolution itself. Nevertheless, for several weeks after the Bolshevik rise to power, the new regime fostered workers' control in the factories with the aim of consolidating popular support. On the 25th of October, the day of insurrection, the Military Revolutionary Committee issued a triumphant proclamation, quote, to the citizens of Russia, end quote. Quote, the cause for which the people have been fighting, the immediate proposal of a democratic peace, the abolition of landlords' property rights over the land, workers' control over production, the creation of a Soviet government, that cause has been won. Long live the revolution of workmen, soldiers, and peasants, end quote. On that same day, Lenin told the Petrograd Soviet that the new government would establish, quote, genuine workers' control over production, end quote. The Soviet promptly adopted a resolution to that effect, which the Second Congress of the Soviets approved on the following day. The cause of workers' control had been won, yet the true meaning of the slogan had still to be determined. On the eve of the uprising, Lenin made it plain that workers' control did not mean the seizure of the factories. Quote, the key to the matter, bracket, he wrote in, quote, will the Bolsheviks retain state power, end quote, end bracket, will not lie in the confiscation of capitalist property, but in statewide, all-embracing workers' control over the capitalists and their supporters. By confiscation alone, you will accomplish nothing, for in that there is no element of organization, of accounting, or of correct distribution, end quote. Lenin. In this passage, Lenin was repeating what he had written after the first conference of the Petrograd Factory Committees in June. After the first conference of Petrograd Factory Committees in June, workers' control meant control by the Soviets and not, quote, the ridiculous passing of the railroads into the hands of the railwaymen, the leather factories into the hands of the leather workers, end quote. The latter interpretation would lead not to socialism but to anarchy. Nevertheless, the first draft decree on workers' control, set down by Lenin himself a few days after the Bolshevik coup d'etat, had a strong syndicalist flavor. It would have been a serious tactical error to disclaim local control by the workers before the revolution was secure. The draft decree, published on November 3rd, provided for the introduction of workers' control in all enterprises employing 5 or more workmen or handling at least 10,000 rubles a year. As the executors of control, the factory committees were to have access to all company records and to all stores of materials, tools, and products. The decisions of the committees, moreover, would be binding on the administration. Finally, both labor and management would be responsible to the state for maintaining order and discipline in the factories. The draft apparently was designed to secure the allegiance of the working masses. It went further in the direction of syndicalism than any of the Bolshevik resolutions at labor conferences before the insurrection. Omitted were the earlier references, quote, to the planned regulation of production, and, quote, the gradual achievement of complete regulation of production, end quote. It seemed that the exponents of a radical brand of workers' control had gained a notable victory. In taking this extremist course, Lenin was not oblivious to the urgency of bringing order out of the economic chaos in Russia, but Lenin gave tactical priority to securing the loyalty of the workers by promising the workers the speedy realization of the workers' utopia. Footnote. Oh, never mind, that's in Russian, fuck that. 2 weeks later, Lenin was sufficiently confident of his party's hold on political power to shift his position on workers' control slightly towards the right. As yet, Lenin had no intention of joining the trade unionists in their campaign to inaugurate state control of industry. The factory committees were the chief support of the Bolsheviks, whereas the unions were still highly susceptible to Menshevik influence. What Lenin did was to return to the phraseology of the Bolshevik resolutions on workers' control adopted by factory committee conferences from May through October. In conjunction with the Central Council of Petrograd factory committees, Lenin redrafted the decree in a more systematic fashion, including in the decree the familiar phrase, quote, the planned regulation of the economy, end quote. Footnote. Again, it's all in Russian. I'm reading that. Where the hell was I? Okay. In its final form, the decree made the factory committee the control organ of each enterprise. The committee was made responsible to a local council of workers' control, whose members would be chosen from factory committees, trade unions, and workers' cooperatives. The local council was in turn subordinated to an all-Russian council of workers' control, composed of representatives from the Central Executive Committee of the Soviet, the All-Russian Council of Trade Unions, the All-Russian Council of Factory Committees, and other labor organizations. The factory committees were given the power to exercise control over the production of goods, the purchase of materials and finances. The decisions of the committees would be binding upon the manufacturers, who could, however, appeal them to the higher organs of control. Footnote. The All-Russian Council of Workers' Control held only 2 sessions on November 25th and December 5th. At these meetings, it discussed organizational matters and drew up an instruction on workers' control. According to David Ryazanov, the council met either once or not at all. C. E. H. Carr, The Bolshevik Revolution, 1917 to 1923. But in this he was mistaken. David Ryazanov was mistaken. The All-Russian Council of Workers' Control, was absorbed by the Supreme Economic Council, the VSNKH, on December 5th, when the matter was created by when the VSNKH, the Supreme Economic Council, was created by the Soviet government. The Council of Workers' Control for the Central Industrial Region, Moscow, survived until May 1918. End footnote. Although the decree created a hierarchy of control organs, real power rested with the individual factory committees, and in practice the local committees remained largely independent of the higher bodies of control. As the Central Council of Petrograd factory committees informed the administration of the Urania electric factory, the factory committee was, quote, the supreme boss in the plant, end quote. The resulting situation was neither socialism nor state capitalism. The decree gave powerful new impetus to a form of syndicalism bordering on total anarchy. While the decree aimed to achieve, quote, the planned regulation of the economy, end quote, the decree encouraged precisely the opposite tendency. During the next few months, Russian workers enjoyed a degree of freedom unprecedented in their history. A few days before the decree was promulgated, A. Lazovsky, S.A. Dridzo, a leading Bolshevik trade unionist, criticized it in the following words, quote, the fundamental defect of this project is that it stands outside all connection with the planned regulation of the national economy and dissipates control over production instead of concentrating it. End quote. Lazovsky was joined by several of his comrades on the Petrograd Council of Trade Unions, Gastev, Laurin, Garvey, and Kammermacher, in a bitter assault upon the proposed law. These men were Mensheviks, ex-Mensheviks, and Mezryansky, who had become Bolsheviks or rightist Bolsheviks. All were ardent trade unionists who distrusted the unbridled syndicalism of workers' control by the factory committees. Kammermacher of the Printers' Union argued that the decree sanctioned, quote, civil war, end quote, in the factories, and Gastev declared that workers' control as expounded in the draft would amount to, quote, control in one's own hut, end quote. It's interesting that's what's being left out of here, at least at this point in the article, is a potential third alternative to centralized planning and a certain segregated or separated type of market socialism that seems to be kind of advocated by, seems to be theorizes the two kind of possibilities, as if there wasn't a possibility of some kind of democratic planning that coordinated efforts between factories on an increasingly non-market democratic basis. The decree was defended by Skripnik, Antipov, and Derbyshев, Bolshevik members of the Central Committee of Petrograd Factory Committees, who shared with Lenin responsibility for the new measure. On November 14th, the decree was promulgated, and 2 days later, the Fifth Conference of Petrograd Factory Committees held the triumphant event. The delegates praised the measure for giving the workers a dominant role in industry and for guiding, quote, the organization of the economy of the country in the direction of the socialist order, end quote. About the same time, a member of the Central Council of Kiev Factory Committees lauded the decree for assigning to the working class, quote, the preponderant role in the organization of the economic life of industry, end quote. The factory committee leaders accentuated the word, quote, organization, end quote, for it implied that the committees would not play the passive role of observing the mechanisms of production. This point was made abundantly clear in an, quote, instruction, end quote, on workers' control, issued by the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees to guide the local committees in their implementation of the new law. The instruction emphasized that factory committee decisions would be binding on the administrative and that non-compliance might be punished by sequestration. Honestly, I don't know what that word means. Let's see what the dictionary says. No, there's like a million different definitions of it. I'm not gonna fucking sit here with that. Workers' control, moreover, was interpreted, quote, in the broad sense of interference in the directives of the entrepreneur, end quote. That is, not as passive surveillance, but as the, quote, active supervision, end quote, of production, as, quote, the participation in the organization of production itself, end quote. But the instruction of the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees did not end the debate over the meaning of workers' control. A separate instruction was distributed by the short-lived All-Russian Council of Workers' Control, containing a far more moderate interpretation. The function of management was, quote, reserved for the owner, end quote, and the factory committees were barred under any circumstances from confiscating the enterprise. Footnote. Note. Russian footnote. I'll read it. Which of the two instructions, the radical or the moderate, would be adopted as the official interpretation of the decree on workers' control was the crucial question. The answer had to await the first All-Russian Congress of Trade Unions, January 1918, which decided the fate of both workers' control and the factory committees. Footnote. Interesting repercussions of the debate on workers' control were heard as recently as 1956. After Khrushchev denounced Stalin at the 20th Party Congress, several unorthodox articles on the events of 1917 appeared in a Russian journal that I can't pronounce. It's in, Cyrillic, is that what they call it? One of the articles, number 5, 1956, interpreted workers' control as a, quote, form of state capitalism, end quote, thus agreeing with the viewpoint of rightist Bolsheviks like Lazovsky. Nasserin added that technical experts were needed to perform the complex tasks of production, that Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries served alongside the Bolsheviks in the factory committees, and that nationalization was spontaneous at first and not a planned Bolshevik policy. As a result of this and other articles, some of the editors were dismissed for allowing, quote, Menshevism, end quote, to creep into their journal. The, quote, correct line on workers' control is presented in something in Russian. The instruction on workers' control of the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees is upheld, while the instruction of the All-Russian Council of Workers' Control is condemned as Menshevik-inspired. This article, is, by the way, is from 1963. End footnote. For the moment, the controversy over workers' control continued unabated. Writing in the Journal of the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees, A.M. Katkin repudiated a passive role for the committees and described state control as, quote, a dead framework, end quote, that could no longer suit the new conditions existing in Russia. Mensheviks and Bolsheviks who favored state control of industry were, quote, sorry economists, end quote, harboring the reformist ideas of the, quote, economists, whom Lenin had attacked 15 years before. Katkin wrote that the workers themselves would create a new way of life. Workers' control was the wave of the future. The most articulate spokesman of the Bolshevik trade unionists was Lazovsky. In a perceptive book entitled Workers' Control, Lazovsky disparaged the instruction published by the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees. Lazovsky returned to the fundamental question of historical stages. Lazovsky regarded as premature the interpretation of workers' control as the, quote, organization of industry. One could speak of, quote, organization by the workers, end quote, he wrote, only if socialism were an immediate prospect. But this was not the case in Russia, which first had to experience a long transitional period, a period of state capitalism. In the debate preceding the promulgation of the decree on workers' control, Lazovsky had insisted that any legislation on the subject, quote, make an absolutely clear and categorical reservation that the workmen in each enterprise should not get the impression the enterprise belongs to them, end quote. Yet the instruction of the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees, wrote Lazovsky, in Workers' Control, in effect, quote, abolished the entrepreneur, end quote, and made the factory committee, quote, the boss of the given enterprise, end quote. Footnote. The role of the owner and his technical assistants was, quote, reduced to zero, end quote. End footnote. The transfer of the factories to the workers on the spot was, quote, not only not socialism, but on the contrary, a step backward, a strengthening of the capitalist mode of production, albeit along new lines, end quote. Footnote. At the end of January 1918, Lazovsky told the All-Russian Congress of Trade Unions and Factory Committees that the seizure of management by the factory committees meant, quote, creating not one but 1,000 owners, end quote. End footnote. David Ryazanov, Goldendock, the Marxist scholar, made the identical point in August when Ryazanov claimed that, quote, the fanatical patriotism, end quote, of the factory committees would lead to, quote, the same sort of atomization as the capitalist system, end quote. The two former mezraiantsi feared that the old capitalist wine of, quote, anarchy of production, end quote, would merely be poured into new syndicalist bottles. Lazovsky was justified in warning that the new decree and the instruction of the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees would reinvigorate the destructive forces in Russian industry. Until October, workers' control, though widespread, often took a passive observational form. Instances of confiscation or direct intervention in management were rare, especially in comparison with instances of land seizure by the peasants. After its legalization, however, workers' control spread quickly and in a more active form than ever before. Many workers were convinced that the Bolshevik Revolution had delivered the means of production into their hands. By the end of 1917, effective capitalist management was vanishing from Russian industry. Footnote. J. Maynard, Russia in Flux, estimates that within a few months after the revolution, about only 1/5 of the enterprises continued to operate under the old ownership and management. The rest, says Maynard, were about evenly divided between nationalization and workers' control, which in practice were not very different. In Moscow in February 1918, workers' control over raw materials was exercised in about 32% of the factories, and control over fuel in about 27%. End footnote. But the factory committees encountered serious difficulties in handling the technical aspects of management, especially finances, notwithstanding the assistance from experts supplied by the Central Council of Factory Committees. Nor did resistance from the bourgeoisie evaporate overnight. In November, the Union of Petrograd Engineers declared that ordinary workmen were incapable of performing the complex tasks of management. The Petrograd Society of Manufacturers, quote, categorically rejected, end quote, workers' control outside a state framework, arguing that the proletariat was, quote, totally unprepared to direct the extremely complicated mechanism of industry, end quote. Weeks after the decree was published, individual employers and their organizations continued to condemn workers' control as, quote, a pernicious measure, end quote. Quote, an encroachment upon the independence and self-direction of the enterprises, end quote. Quote, an invasion by the working class, end quote. Footnote. On November 23rd, the All-Russian Commercial Industrial Organization resolved to close enterprises in which the workers demanded control. End footnote. To the countless denunciations of this sort, the Central Committee of Petrograd Factory Committees responded with determination. Quote, The owner of the factory is obliged to subordinate himself to the decisions of the control commissions in finances as well as in purchases and sales. If not, the enterprise will be requisitioned and management transferred to the factory committees, end quote. Local workers answered the bourgeois opposition by, quote, nationalizing, end quote, their factories, which in reality meant confiscating them independently of central direction or control. Quote, numerous witnesses testify, end quote, reads a report of the International Labor Office, quote, that in the beginning the proletariat understood nationalization to be a direct entry into possession of each factory by that factory's workmen, and that the factory committee had the widest possible powers not only as to direction but as to the disposal of all the mill and factory property, end quote. Footnote, International Labor Office, Labor Conditions in Soviet Russia. End footnote. The syndicalist tide was carrying Russia to the brink of economic collapse. A British trade union delegation visited Russia in 1924, reported with characteristic English understatement that workers' control in 1917, quote, had a very bad effect on production, end quote. Footnote, Russia, the official report of the British trade union delegation to Russia and Caucasia. The workers said, end footnote. The workers said the report had been converted into, quote, a new body of shareholders, end quote. Time and again, Russian critics of workers' control charged that the individual factory committee, like the individual capitalist, ignored the interest of the economy, quote, as a whole, end quote. A Bolshevik writer observed in March 1918 that the workers considered tools and equipment, quote, their own property, end quote. The factory committees had the, quote, widest possible powers, end quote, over the disposition of property, reported the ILO. Cases of pillage and theft were not uncommon. W.H. Chamberlain recounts an anecdote about a worker who was asked, quote, what would you do if you were the director of the factory, end quote. Quote, I should steal 100 rubles and run away, end quote, he replied. Footnote, W.H. Chamberlain, The Russian Revolution, 1917 to 1921, published in 1957. Individual factory committees sent, quote, pushers, end quote, Tolkachi, into the provinces to purchase fuel and raw materials, sometimes for outrageous prices. Often they refused to share available supplies with other committees in the direst need. Footnote, at the All-Russian Congress of Textile Unions and Factory Committees, Lazovsky told of the refusal of the Workers' Committee of the Treugolnik rubber factory to share its fuel reserves with other enterprises. Finally, after a long debate, the committee agreed to sell fuel at 8 rubles a pood, though the normal price was 2 rubles. Lazovsky called this, quote, a maximal distortion of the idea of socialism, an extremely dangerous understanding of the idea of workers' control, end quote. End footnote. The local committees raised wages or prices indiscriminately and on occasion cooperated with the owners in return for special, quote, bonuses. Footnote, some Russian author says that owners sometimes use the factory committees as their, quote, agents. Collusion between the owners and the committees rendered workers' control, quote, fictitious, end quote, according to so-and-so. It's in Cyrillic, so I can't say the name. End footnote. While the British trade union delegation simply stated that workers' control had, quote, a very bad effect, end quote, on production, a more vivid assessment was made by another English observer, a reporter for the Manchester Guardian, traveling in Russia in 1917 and 1918. Quote, it is no exaggeration to say that during November, December, and the greater part of January, something approaching anarchy reigned in the industries of northern Russia, ... There was no common industrial plan. Factory committees had no higher authority to which to look for direction. They acted entirely on their own and tried to solve those problems of production and distribution which seemed most pressing for the immediate future and for the locality. Machinery is sometimes sold in order to buy raw materials. The factories became like anarchistic communes, ... Anarcho-syndicalist tendencies began to run riot, end quote. Footnote. M.P. Price, My Reminiscences of the Russian Revolution. End footnote. This state of affairs seemed nightmarish not only to the manufacturers but to many workers and intellectuals as well. The Menshevik-dominated printers' union decried the, quote, anarcho-syndicalist illusions, end quote, of their less sophisticated confrères, while moderate Bolshevik trade unionists condemned the factory committees for their, quote, fanatical patriotism, end quote, their, quote, parochial patriotism, end quote, their, quote, local pride, in their, quote, own hut, end quote. Footnote, Ryazanov and Lazovsky. End footnote. Workers' control by itself, end quote, wrote I.U. Boyarkov in the Metalworkers Journal, quote, is an anarchistic attempt to achieve socialism in one enterprise and actually leads to clashes among the workers themselves and to the refusal of fuel, metal, etc. to one another, end quote. The organs of control, Boyarkov continued, should occupy positions in an overall system of state regulation. Quote, state regulation of the economy by means of workers' control, here is our slogan, end quote. Boyarkov, in effect, was endorsing, quote, state workers' control, end quote, a formula invented in a few weeks earlier by the Bolshevik economist V.P. Miliutin. In November, Miliutin himself, as Lenin's spokesman on workers' control, reiterated his belief that control should be united into, quote, one solid state apparatus, end quote. When the new year arrived, the Bolshevik leader finally took heed of this advice. To Lenin, workers' control did not signify the expropriation of the tools of production. It meant bookkeeping, inspection, accounting devices which would enable the proletariat to oversee the bourgeoisie while learning the procedures of manufacture. But Lenin could not allow the working masses to practice their future administrative role at the expense of the new government. The elemental tide in the factories had to be diverted and the factory committees brought under state control. A week before the publication of the November 14th Decree on Workers' Control, Lenin had already revealed his intention to the Petrograd Soviet when he referred to the committees as, quote, state institutions. On December 4th, Lenin obliquely repeated the familiar trade union criticism that factory committee patriotism conflicted with the national interest. Quote, "Let every factory committee," end quote, Lenin told the workers' section of the Petrograd Soviet, quote, "consider itself not merely as being occupied with the affairs of its own plant, but as organizational cells for the adjustment of state life as a whole," end quote. What was required was the centralized regulation of industry rather than the spontaneous confiscation of the means of production by the workers on the spot. On December 1st, the government created the Supreme Economic Council, VSNKH, assigning to it the mission of working out, quote, "a plan for the regulation of the economic life of the country," end quote. The VSNKH absorbed the All-Russian Council of Workers' Control and integrated the function of control into the overall task of regulating the economy. As Lenin observed the following month, quote, "From workers' control we passed to the creation of the Supreme Economic Council. Only this measure in conjunction with the nationalization of the banks and the railroads, will enable us to launch the construction of a new socialist economy," end quote. Although the Supreme Economic Council and its network of local economic councils, Sovnarkozy, decreed into existence later in December, consisted of factory committee and trade union members, the control function exercised by the workers in the localities were officially at least fitted into a state framework. And though the syndicalist tide could not be stemmed overnight, indeed local control by workers' committees flourished until the summer of 1918. A major step had been taken towards the, quote, "statization," end quote, "agospodarstvenny," of industrial control. But before the regulation of industry could be effectively transferred to the new state apparatus, it was necessary to centralize the centrifugal labor movement. If an even pulse was to be restored in the factories, anarchic freedom had to give way to labor discipline. The official cry was raised for, quote, "iron discipline," end quote, in the factories and mines, and the hitherto neglected trade unions were chosen to bring order to the chaotic proletarian world. Before the October Revolution, competition between the factory committees and the unions, especially in Petrograd, was very keen. On the eve of the insurrection, the trade unionists, both Menshevik and Bolshevik, made a concerted effort to block the formation of an independent factory committee organization. They achieved a notable victory at the All-Russian Conference of Factory Committees, October 17th through 22nd, when a special commission on factory committee trade union relations voted 5-3 to consider the new All-Russian Council of Factory Committees a division of the All-Russian Council of Trade Unions. There is no indication that this important decision was approved by the conference at large, but the campaign of the trade union partisans was sufficiently energetic for the anarcho-syndicalist Piotrovsky to warn that, quote, "the trade unions, bracket, wanted, end bracket, to devour the factory committees," end quote. With the rapid, quote, "Bolshevization," end quote, of the higher trade union echelons during the final months of 1917, prospects for a, quote, "merger," end quote, Siliani, as the union officials termed it, between the unions and the factory committees seemed to improve. In Petrograd, the larger Union of Metal Workers began to assert its authority over the workers' committees in the metal plants, and the fifth conference of the factory committees called for, quote, "friendly joint work," end quote, with the unions. In the provinces, where friction between the two labor organizations had never been as acute as in the capital, frequent attempts were made to draw the factory committees into the local union apparatus. During the first weeks of its existence, the Bolshevik government had supported the factory committees and workers' control in order to secure the loyalty of the proletarian rank and file. In December, however, the Council of People's Commissars had created a network of state economic councils to regulate production. A month later, steps were taken to, quote, statize the labor movement as well. The scene was the first All-Russian Congress of Trade Unions, which met from January 7th to 14th, 1918. Of the 416 voting delegates representing 2,500,000 trade union members, the Bolsheviks commanded a large majority, 273, not counting the 21 leftist Rs who voted with them. Among their opponents, the Mensheviks had 66 delegates, while the anarcho-syndicalists had only 6. The remaining delegates consisted of 10 right SRs, 6 maximalists, and 34 non-party workers. The Bolshevik Commissar of Labor, Alexander Shliapnikov, opened the Congress with an attack on the Menshevik policy of, quote, conciliation toward the enemies of the working class. Pavlov, a Menshevik union leader, replied by condemning the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly on the previous day as an example of Bolshevik, quote, political terror. Quote, the Bolshevik Party, end quote, Pavlov declared, quote, has annihilated freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of the press, personal inviolability, and freedom of coalitions, end quote. A few months later, Lazovsky, in a similar vein, expressed shock over the, quote, hooligan murder, end quote, of the cadet leaders Shingarev and Kokoshkin, an emotion shared by the delegates of the right. Lazovsky's speech was an indication of the affinity between the Bolshevik trade unionists and the Mensheviks. If, as Zinoviev maintained in his report on the, quote, current moment, end quote, the Congress was divided between, quote, the mountain and the Gironde, end quote, which were parties in the French Revolution. Then on some crucial issues, the Mensheviks and rightist Bolsheviks were Girondists together. One such issue is Marx's interpretation of history. In a lengthy address, Julius Martov expressed the Menshevik view that Russia was experiencing a bourgeois democratic revolution in which the, quote, fundamental preconditions for the achievement of socialism, end quote, were absent. As the Menshevik trade unionist F.A. Cherevinin Lipkin put it at a later session of the Congress, quote, the more backward countries from the Marxist point of view are the least able to pass on to socialism, end quote. Ryazanov, a diligent student of Marx, was in general agreement with this interpretation of history, and his assertion that, quote, we do not as yet have the preconditions for socialism, end quote, was greeted by applause from the right and center. Socialism, after all, could not be achieved, quote, overnight, end quote, said Ryazanov, echoing Lenin's own words. Footnote, Lenin had accused the anarcho-syndicalists of desiring to abolish the state, quote, overnight, end quote, end footnote. Lazovsky and Ryazanov were the Dioscuri of the Bolshevik trade unionists. Besides their common stand on the factory committees and workers' control, they objected to the Bolshevik suppression of the press in November and were the only two eminent Bolsheviks to oppose the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly. Until July 1917, both had been Mezraiansi, and their tenor as Bolsheviks was intermittent. Footnote, early in 1918, Ryazanov resigned from the party and Lazovsky was expelled. Early in 1918. Lazovsky rejoined the party, becoming the head of the Profintern in 1921. Ryazanov was also readmitted, only to be purged at the, quote, Menshevik trial, end quote, in 1931. Lazovsky was purged during the, quote, Crimean affair and executed in 1952. Ryazanov was also executed. End footnote. At the first Congress of Trade Unions, each censored the Bolshevik-dominated Central Council of Petrograd factory committees for siding with the anarcho-syndicalists on the question of workers' control. The anarcho-syndicalists, Lazovsky said, were engaged in, quote, an idyllic, end quote, quest for the, quote, bluebird, end quote, of happiness. Realistically viewed, Russia required, quote, the centralization of workers' control, end quote, in conformity with the general plan. Ryazanov advised the factory committees to, quote, commit suicide, end quote, by becoming, quote, an integral element, end quote, of the trade union structure. The half-dozen anarcho-syndicalist delegates fought a desperate battle to save the committees. It was, quote, absurd, declared G.P. Maximov, to say that Russia was in, quote, the stage of bourgeois revolution, end quote. The current revolution would, quote, clear the way toward the realization of the ultimate goal, the complete freedom of the proletariat, end quote. According to Medintsev, a fellow anarcho-syndicalist, socialism would be attained only through, quote, the syndicalist movement, end quote, which would, quote, sweep away the capitalist order, end quote. Maximov claimed that the anarcho-syndicalists were, quote, better Marxist, end quote, than either the Mensheviks or the Bolsheviks, an assertion which understandably caused a stir in the hall. Excitement in the Congress reached a climax when Bill Shatov, an active member of the Industrial Workers of the World before his return to Russia in 1917, characterized the trade unions as, quote, living corpses and urged the workers, quote, to organize in the localities and create a free new Russia without a god, without a czar, without a boss in the trade union, end quote. Ryazanov deplored Shatov's reference to the unions as, quote, living corpses, end quote, but Maximov dismissed Ryazanov's objections as those of a non-proletarian member of the labor movement, a theorist who had never worked, never sweated, never felt life. Footnote. Later in the month, at the first Congress of Textile Unions and Factory Committees, Veselovsky, evidently an anarcho-syndicalist, spoke of the, quote, dead trade unions, end quote, and held that, quote, it is impossible to have central organizations every time, end quote. Lazovsky wrote that the anarcho-syndicalists had, quote, created a whole theory that the trade unions have died, end quote. End footnote. Ryazanov, in short, was one of the intellectuals who, as the anarcho-syndicalist Renev predicted on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, would, quote, betray the working masses. Footnote. Renev had warned the Fourth Conference of Petrograd Factory Committees that, quote, the intellectuals in no case can represent the interests of the workers. The intellectuals know how to twist us around their fingers, and they will betray us, end quote. Renev's statement was not an original thought. The same idea had been expressed earlier by Bakunin and by Vaclav Mahaisky. In later years, it was to be reiterated eloquently by Max Nomad in 3 books: Rebels and Renegades, published in 1932, Apostles of Revolution, published in 1939, and Aspects of Revolt, published in 1959. End footnote. The revolution, declared still another anarcho-syndicalist delegate, Laptev, was made, quote, not only by the intellectuals, but by the masses, end quote. Thus it was imperative for Russia, quote, to listen to the voice of the working masses, the voice from below, ... end quote. But the Bolshevik leaders had listened long enough to the destructive voice from below. It was time at long last to heed the proponents of state control, of a central economic plan, of a statewide trade union apparatus. During the spring, when it had seemed necessary in order to undermine the existing order, Lenin had joined forces with the anarcho-syndicalists in support of the factory committees and workers' control. Now Lenin sided with the Menshevik and rightist Bolshevik champions of the trade unions and of state control. The First Congress of Trade Unions, with its overwhelming Bolshevik majority, voted to transform the factory committees into primary union organs. The unions, however, would emulate the committees by organizing along industrial rather than craft lines, according to the principle of, quote, one factory, one union, end quote. Footnote. As the future trade union head, M.P. Tomsky, put it, every effort would be made, quote, to create trade unions on the lines of the factory committees, end quote. This would not be too difficult a task, for by 1918 most of the large unions already were organized along industrial lines. End footnote. The Bolshevik leadership parted company with its own right-wing unionists and with the Mensheviks by forbidding the establishment of, quote, neutral, end quote, unions, that is, unions existing independently of the state. Trade union neutrality was deemed a, quote, bourgeois, end quote, idea and an anomaly in a worker state. With the, quote, statization of the unions and conversion of the factory committees into local union cells, the committees became, quote, state institutions, as Lenin desired. Furthermore, with the incorporation of the committees into the trade union structure, the dichotomy of functions between the two labor organizations was obliterated. Workers' control was now, quote, inseparably tied to a general system of regulation, end quote, operating in accordance with a general plan. The Congress made it clear that control did, quote, not mean the transfer of the enterprise to the hands of the workers, end quote, and it approved the moderate instruction on workers' control drawn upon by the defunct All-Russian Council of Workers' Control rather than the syndicalist instruction of the Central Council of Factory Committees. The, quote, centralization of workers' control, end quote, now became the task of the trade unions. According to Ryazanov, the Special Committee of the All-Russian Conference of Factory Committees already had, quote, signed the death warrant, end quote, of the committees when it voted to subordinate the All-Russian Council of Factory Committees to the corresponding trade union body. That action, to be sure, was a significant incursion into the independence of the committees, but their true, quote, death warrant, end quote, was the resolution of the First Congress of Trade Unions requiring the factory committees to enter the trade union structure. In effect, the committees had been ordered to, quote, commit suicide, end quote, as Ryazanov had advised, by leaping into the jaws of the unions. Thus, it was Piotrovsky's fearful prophecy that the trade unions would, quote, devour, end quote, the factory committees fulfilled. Before, quote, committing suicide, end quote, the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees registered its last words of protest. The Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees accused the Trade Union Congress of clinging to outworn forms and habits and charged the rightist delegates, notably Ryazanov, with exercising a disproportionate influence in shaping the decisions. At the sixth and last conference of Petrograd Factory Committees held at the end of January, M.N. Zhivotov, a Bolshevik champion of the committees, complained that the moderate instruction on workers' control of the All-Russian Council of Workers' Control was inferior to that of the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees. Katkin, a comrade of Zhivotov's on the Central Council, persisted in defending the right of the factory committees to confiscate their enterprises if necessary, as the more radical instruction provided. But these last stand protests fell on deaf ears. The Sixth Conference approved the, quote, merger, end quote, for as Weinberg, an outspoken Bolshevik laborer, argued, the existence of two parallel labor organizations was, quote, a luxury, end quote, which Russia could not afford. In March, the Central Council of Petrograd Factory Committees was absorbed by the Sovnarkozy of the Northern Industrial Region, and its journal, Novyi Put, ceased to appear. Footnote. The instruction of the All-Russian Council of Workers' Control was also approved by the First Congress of Textile Trade Union and Factory Committees. End footnote. The force and excitement of the year-long debate were spent. The Bolshevik rise to power rendered academic any quarrels over the unfolding of history or the proper uses of political and economic power. With respect to the stages of history, the theory of, quote, uninterrupted, end quote, revolution had been the battle cry of the Bolshevik leaders against the rigid determinists in the Menshevik camp. Lenin deplored the, quote, tail-endism, end quote, of those, quote, sorry economists, end quote, who concerned themselves with economic reform rather than with political action. Lenin desired an unremitting class struggle. His voluntarist streak impelled him, in the words of Narodnik terrorist Zhilia Bov, to, quote, give history a push, end quote. Footnote, quoted in B.D. Wolf, Three Who Made a Revolution, end footnote. From April through November, Lenin had aligned himself with the anarcho-syndicalists who desired the utter annihilation of the old order. The trade unions were then regarded as a, quote, dead framework, end quote. But after the Bolshevik Revolution was secured, Lenin abandoned the forces of destruction for those of centralization and order. Lenin did not wish to push history too far. From the syndicalism of workers' control, Lenin, quote, stepped backwards, end quote, to state capitalism, discarded the factory committees of the trade unions. Having first sided with the left to defeat the right, Lenin now reversed his position in order to eliminate the left, the factory committee, quote, patriots, end quote, and the left communists. In backward Russia, the Bolsheviks had seized power in the name of socialism, in spite of Marx's dictum that political change lags behind economic and technological change. Now Russia's economy had to catch up with the political revolution. The left, disgusted by Lenin's, quote, retreat, end quote, to state capitalism, was destined to act as his gadfly. The banner of workers' control had not been run down for all time at the first Congress of Trade Unions. It was raised again in the early months of 1918 by the left communists led by Bukharin, Obolensky, and Smirnov. These men opposed a, quote, breathing space, end quote, whether afforded by the Brest-Litovsk Treaty or by state capitalism. They wanted to press forward with the, quote, revolutionary war, end quote, abroad, and with the socialization of production at home, including workers' control and the extensive nationalization of industry. Footnote. See L. Shapiro, I think it's Leonard Shapiro, The Origin of the Communist Autocracy, published in 1956. Bukharin incidentally expressed the same distrust of the new ruling class as the anarcho-syndicalists had. Quote, Comrade Lenin has written that in Russia every scullion will be taught to govern the country. It is a good thing to teach a scullion to govern a country, but what will be the result if you put a commissar over the scullion? End quote. The hell is a scullion? Is it a cook? Yeah, a servant is assigned the most menial kitchen tasks. End footnote. Opposition from the left communists dissolved in the turmoil of the Civil War, but neither the, quote, spirit of the masses, end quote, nor the dream of popular rule was dead. The search for a, quote, golden age, end quote, was resumed after the Civil War by the workers' opposition, whom Lenin acrimoniously referred to as, quote, anarcho-syndicalists. With the anarcho-syndicalists, the workers' opposition considered the Bolshevik leaders a caste of self-seeking intellectuals who had betrayed the interests of the masses. It was the masses, as Laptev told the First Congress of Trade Unions in 1918, who made the revolution in the first place. Lenin and his party had merely risen to power on the spontaneous tide from below. Footnote. On May 23, 1917, a meeting of industrialists of South Russia declared, quote, "The working class, captivated by the tempting prospects depicted by its leaders, anticipates the coming of a golden age, and terrible shall be its disappointment, which one cannot but foresee," end quote. End footnote. The great achievement of the Bolsheviks was not in making the revolution, but in slowing the revolution down and diverting the revolution into communist, capital C, channels, or as Maximov wrote 20 years later, in forcing it into a Marxist, quote, Procrustean bed, end quote. Footnote, G.P. Maximov, The Guillotine at Work, 20 Years of Terror in Russia, published in Chicago in 1940. End footnote. The astonishing feat of the Bolsheviks was their success in checking the elemental drive of the Russian masses towards a chaotic utopia. Thanks for listening.